Welcome once again to the Introduction to the New Testament. In Lesson 1, we discovered how the New Testament came to be, from the thoughts in God's mind all the way to those thoughts entering our mind, as we read the pages of the New Testament Scripture. Well, in Lesson 2, we will continue our discovering and learning a bit more about the historical and the cultural backdrop of the New Testament world. At the beginning of any good story, whether it's a book, a TV series, or a movie, there's always time given to establish the setting of the story. Where is the story taking place? What is the time these events are happening? And what are the circumstances that led up to the story? These and other questions are extremely important for the viewer to understand what's going on, and the better the backdrop is revealed, the more the viewer is caught up in the story itself. Well, in the same way, we cannot assume that we understand what it was like in the ancient world of the New Testament. One of the worst mistakes a student of the New Testament can make is to think that they understand what the Scriptures say outside of its historical or cultural backdrop. It is ridiculous to think that we, in our 21st century Western mindset, can fully understand Scripture written in the first century Palestine. Yet it is one of the most common mistakes that are made today. So, in this lesson, we're going to journey more than 2,000 years back in time to the other side of the world, and we're going to try to see the world through the eyes of the writers of the New Testament. And perhaps the best place to start is at the end of the Old Testament. At the end of the Old Testament book of 2 Kings, we find that the northern and the southern nations of Israel have been taken captive by the Babylonian Empire. This captivity began about 606 BC and it lasted for 70 years. The Old Testament books Ezekiel and Daniel tell of this time of Jewish captivity. But near the end of the 70 years, the nation of Babylon was conquered by the Persians. And in 538 BC, during his first year of reign, Cyrus, king of Persia, issued a decree to allow the captive Jews to return back to the Holy Land. He even promised to pay for the rebuilding of the temple with money from the royal treasury. A majority of the Jews preferred to remain in Babylon, but about 42,000 did return under the leadership of a man named Sheshbazzar, and these returning Jews began to rebuild the temple. But because of the efforts of some who opposed rebuilding the temple, the construction of the temple was delayed for over 20 years. But then in 458 BC, another delegation of Jews, headed by Ezra the scribe, set out for Jerusalem. And then, some 13 years later, Nehemiah joined them. And it was Nehemiah who led the people to rebuild the demolished wall that was meant to protect Jerusalem. And Nehemiah, aided by Ezra, also instituted the strict applications of Jewish laws that they had learned from Moses. These Jews were strongly devoted to the Old Testament law. And the Old Testament books Nehemiah and Ezra, as well as Haggai, and Zechariah, and Malachi, describe this time that the Jews returned to Jerusalem. Although the Jews were still under Persian rule during this time, they lived in relative peace. More importantly, never again did the Jews turn away from Yahweh to worship false gods. Eventually, the Persian Empire was conquered by the infamous Alexander the Great. Beginning with the victories in 334 BC, Alexander the Great spread his rule over much of the Middle East. By the time he died prematurely in 323 BC, Alexander's influence extended throughout the known world. With the expansion of the Greek Empire, also came the expansion of what is known as Hellenism, or the spread of Greek language and culture. It is because of Hellenism that Koine Greek became the common language of all the Greek Empire and all of its territories, including Palestine. Hellenism also instituted advanced roadways for easier travel. And even though they were established more than 300 years before Jesus and his disciples, the common language of Greek and the road system of Hellenism made the spread of the gospel message easier for Jesus and his apostles. After Alexander the Great died, there was a lot of bitter fighting for control over the vast empire that he had consumed. Eventually, 3 of Alexander's generals divided up his empire. The first was Antigonus Cyclops, and he controlled Asia Minor, including Syria and Palestine. Ptolemy ruled Egypt and northern Africa, and Seleucus Nicator took the territory stretching from the Mesopotamia eastward to India. But even after this division of the land, the generals continued to fight and battle each other for more and more control. In 301 BC, Antigonus Cyclops was defeated at the Battle of Ipsus, and Seleucus Nicator takes the majority of Antigonus's territory, adding to its already enormous Seleucid Empire. Ptolemy adds Palestine to the south of Syria to his rule of Egypt and North Africa, and Ptolemy and his successors ruled Palestine from 320 to 198 BC. Due to Hellenism, many of the Jews were no longer able to speak their native Hebrew language. As a result, they were unable to read and follow their scriptures, the Old Testament. However, Ptolemy and his successors, when they were ruling Palestine, were kind to the Jews and sponsored the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. This translation, known as the Septuagint, was completed sometime during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, around 285 to 246 BC. Jewish legend says that 72 scholars worked for 72 days on the project, and so the Roman numeral 70, or LXX, is frequently used to represent the Septuagint, meaning 70 serving as the nearest round number to 72. In 198 BC, Antiochus the Great of the Seleucid Empire defeats the Ptolemaic Empire at the Battle of Peneus, gaining control of Palestine, and many of the Seleucid rulers used the name Antiochus. Also, the Seleucids were nowhere near as friendly to the Jewish traditions as the Ptolemaics were. The most infamous emperor of the Seleucid Empire was Antiochus IV, and he ruled from 175 to 163 BC. He was better known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He attempted to force the Greek culture on the Jews. Antiochus invaded Jerusalem in 168 BC, destroyed the city walls, and installed an image of Zeus in the Jewish temple. He also inflicted the death penalty on those who possessed or read the Jewish scriptures. Eventually, devout Jews, under the leadership of a village priest named Mattathias, revolted against the Seleucids in 167 BC. Mattathias soon died, but leadership of the revolt passed quickly to one of his sons named Judas. Judas proved to be such a successful leader that he was given the nickname Maccabeus, meaning the hammer, and the family of Mattathias became known as the Maccabees. Judas led a struggle for freedom by waging successful guerrilla warfare. He ultimately recaptured the temple and all of Palestine and expelled the Seleucids from Jerusalem. And this story is found in 1 Maccabees of the Old Testament Apocrypha that we referenced last lesson. After Judas's death in 160 BC, the struggle continued under the leadership of his brothers, Simon and Jonathan. Simon won Jewish political freedom in 142 BC, and this victory is celebrated each year in December by Jews during the Festival of Dedication, or Lights, otherwise known as Hanukkah. The history of the Maccabean rule in Palestine, also known as the Hasmonean dynasty, after an earlier relative named Hasmon, is a story of strife and discord caused by lust for power. The political aims of the Hasmoneans alienated many of the religious Jews. The descendants of the Hasmoneans became the Sadducees of the New Testament period, and the successors of the devout Jews who opposed the Hasmoneans, they are also known as the Hasidim or the Holy Ones. They became the Pharisees of the New Testament. Unfortunately, Jewish freedom during the Hasmonean dynasty was short-lived. In 146 BC, the growing Roman Empire extended its power over Carthage in North Africa and over almost all of Asia Minor. In 63 BC, Pompey extended that control to Judea. The men who ruled Rome used the Roman army not only to conquer the world, but also to enforce their power at home. In 30 BC, Caesar Augustus crushed his opponents and eventually became the first Roman emperor. He ruled from 27 BC to AD 14, which includes the time of the birth of Christ. During his rule, Augustus revived the Roman religion, reorganized the government for efficiency, and built many splendid buildings. Augustus was both feared and loved by the Romans. Some Romans even worshipped him as Lord and God, but there's no real evidence that Augustus really sought such worship. After Palestine was conquered in 63 BC, the Romans allowed a native vassal ruler named Herod the Great to control Palestine. His father, Antipater, had built favor with the Romans, and he was able to manipulate circumstances to put his son Herod into power. Herod was an efficient ruler and a very clever politician. He provided free grain and clothing during times of famine. He began to build many building projects, and the most notable of which was the beautification of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And although Herod occasionally attended Jewish services, he was not a Jew, but a Moabite, and was generally hated by devout Jews. Plagued by a sense of insecurity, he murdered any who opposed him, including some of his own wives and children. It is this Herod who ordered the slaughter of the Jewish boys under 2 years old in hopes to kill the baby Jesus because of the prophecy that Jesus would become the King of Kings. After Herod's death, his sons inherited parts of his old kingdom. Herod Archelaus ruled Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Herod Antipas inherited the territories of Galilee and Perea. But Herod's sons lacked their father's ability, and eventually all of their rule was stripped from them by Caesar. As the Romans extended their power, they organized the conquered territories into two basic types of provinces. The first is called senatorial provinces, and these areas are relatively peaceful provinces, and they were placed under Roman Senate rule and had officers known as proconsuls. Imperial provinces, however, were more turbulent provinces where more uprisings would be caused, and the emperor directly ruled those areas. These provinces had officers known as procurators or governors. Herod the Great's first son, Herod Archelaus, lost his office due to the misrule that he had done and was replaced with Roman governors. One of them, Pontius Pilate, is the one who heard the Jewish charges against Jesus and ultimately crucified Jesus. Two other governors, Felix and Festus, sat in judgment on Jewish charges against Paul that we see in Acts 23 through 26. The Romans gave considerable liberty to the Roman rulers of the provinces, and in turn, the rulers usually did not interfere with the religious practices of the people in those provinces. The reign of the Roman emperors of the New Testament period led a time of peace known as Pax Romana, and as a result, the stability and the unity of the civilized world under Rome made the spread of Christianity much easier. Some of the other Roman emperors of the 1st century AD also include Tiberius from AD 14 to 37. He was Augustus' adopted son, and he ruled during the time of Jesus' death. Another Caesar, Gaius, also known as Caligula, reigned from AD 37 through 41. And he was mentally unbalanced according to history, and he ruled during the Apostle Paul's early ministry. Claudius ruled from AD 41 to 54, and he's the one who expelled the Jews from Rome due to an outbreak of riots in Rome, according to Acts 18:2. He also made a determined effort to restore Roman religion in its former place of importance. One of the most infamous is Nero, AD 54 to 68, and he was brutal and erratic, and he carried out persecutions against Christians in Rome. Church tradition holds that Peter and Paul actually died under Nero's persecutions. And then we have Domitian from AD 81 through 96. He insisted on being worshipped as Lord and God. Many feel that his terrible persecutions against Christians are actually mentioned in the book of Revelation, such as in Revelation 2:13 and chapter 3, verse 10. Scholars estimate that 4,000 Jews lived in the Roman Empire during the New Testament times, but only 700,000 lived in Palestine itself. Most of the Jews were a part of what is called the diaspora, or the dispersion, or the scattering of a people group. As a result, they lived in cities throughout the Roman world, such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. A common language of the Jewish people during the first century was Aramaic. The language of the Jewish priests was Hebrew. And a great many Jews spoke Greek because of the Hellenism that had occurred. Therefore, it was not uncommon at all for first century Jews to speak 2 or 3 languages. For example, Paul spoke 3 or more languages, and Jesus and his disciples spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and possibly Greek. Judaism had a wealthy aristocracy. Many of these were Sadducees who virtually ruled Judea. They controlled businesses linked with the temple, such as revenues from the sale of sacrificial animals and the exchange of money. Some were also landowners who rented out farmland and received income from crops that they had raised. Most Palestinians, however, were poor farmers, craftsmen, or businessmen. Some of the disciples owned fishing businesses, which provided them adequate support. But slavery was not widely practiced among the Jews. Jewish law made all persons equally responsible before God, and all Jews morally equal in God's sight. It restrained the wealthy Jews from becoming too oppressive in their leadership. Jews regarded the wealthy as especially blessed by God, but in theory, all persons could receive this blessing by good works and moral obedience. In direct contrast to the Jews, however, was the Roman society. The pagan Roman society had clearly defined social classes. The upper class included landowners and businessmen who enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle. And this luxury sapped the vitality of the upper class and discouraged the lower class. The middle class was almost non-existent. Wars that Rome had led to the death of some of the middle class members, and slaves claimed the jobs of others. Many sank into the class that's called the plebs, or the poor people, who quickly followed anyone who offered them food and amusements. But slaves represented the largest portion of the Roman Empire, over half of the Roman population. Now, many of the slaves were well-trained professionals, but they were reduced to the position of slavery because of war or debt or birth, and rarely was it ever because of ethnic differences. Slaves served as physicians, teachers, skilled craftsmen, but the effect of slavery was a cancer on society. Masters depended on slaves for their labor and skill, and thus, often they failed themselves to develop their own ingenuity, and slaves fell into practices of fraud, deceit, and immorality. Living a moral life under this system was almost impossible. The social conditions of unemployment, despair, and greed provided a fertile breeding ground for criminal minds and practices in the first century. In the ancient world, people expressed their inherent religious nature through various religions that had arisen. In early Rome, for instance, each family worshiped the gods of their own farm and home. These gods were a personification of the forces that they met in daily life. Once Rome had conquered Greece, some of its deities were blended into the Greek pantheon. Zeus and Hera, his wife, were the chief gods. At the death of Augustus, the Roman Senate bestowed divinity upon him. Later emperors, Caligula, Nero, and Domitian, actually claimed deity for themselves. Emperor worship made support of the state a religious duty, and the refusal of Christians to practice it exposed them to persecution. Eastern mysticism was also a part of the first century Roman society. The Eastern mystery religions offered personal contact with the deity and promise of personal immortality with an outlet for emotional experiences. As a result, many people follow the superstitious practices of the occult. Formulas and rituals invoke the protection or service of spirits and demons. Horoscopes, astrology, and attempts to predict the future were frequently used in the New Testament world. Educated people of the time, however, typically satisfied their religious longings by various philosophies. For instance, the Gnostics promised salvation through secret knowledge. They believed that the supreme God could have nothing to do with the tangible things. He produced a series of creations, and each one was more worldly and less spiritual than the previous one, the last of which he created the world. Gnostics rejected the world as evil, and so they became ascetics, which means that they practiced strict self-denial. Others promoted immoral behavior since the activities of the body did not affect the soul. Another group are the Epicureans, named after Epicurus of the 4th century BC. They taught that pleasure was the highest good. They sought moderation, tranquility, and peace of mind. Some later followers became totally hedonistic, seeking an excess of pleasure. Stoics are another group, which emphasized virtue instead of pleasure. They stressed responsibility in the face of adversity. They emphasized a duty-bound acceptance of personal fate. Beyond these major philosophies also lie the Cynics and the Skeptics. The Cynics rejected all standards and conventions and tried to live with simple needs. The Skeptics gave up the hope for finding any absolute truth. The Jewish religion stood in stark contrast to the Roman religion in the first century. First century Judaism had several unique features, and although it originated among the Jews, it extended itself to many people called proselytes, or non-Jews who had converted to Judaism. Perhaps central to the Jewish religion is the idea of monotheism. Followers did not even admit to the existence of other gods. The Jewish belief in one God comes from the Old Testament concept of, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." A second major feature of the Jewish religion is called corporate and individual responsibility. The Old Testament emphasized in the fate of the nation as a whole, but later captivity of the nation led to an interest in individual responsibility. The early books of the Old Testament did not place a significant emphasis on individual resurrection, but then some of the prophets and later apocryphal writings in the period between the Testaments indicated a more strongly stated belief in the doctrine of individual faith, individual living, and individual resurrection. Another major feature of the Jewish religion is the coming Messiah. The Jews anticipated the coming of God's deliverer, or the Messiah. They believed that the Messiah would deliver them from political oppression by destroying their enemies. So the Jews were not prepared to accept a Messiah who would suffer for human beings or redeem them by his death. This led to a clash with the apostles who proclaimed that Jesus was God's Messiah, sent to suffer for our sins. Perhaps the centerpiece of the Jewish religion would be the temple. The Jewish temple was the chief center of worship in Jerusalem. Jesus and the apostles taught within its courts, and in the late 50s AD, some Jewish Christians even still took Jewish vows on the temple grounds. Eventually, though, the development of Gentile Christianity finally severed the connection of the temple with Christianity. An alternative to the temple is the synagogue. With the destruction of the Jewish temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC, led to the rise of the synagogue. Generally, synagogues served as a multi-purpose center, including a place for worship, a school, and a community center for Jews. They became so commonplace that the Jews continued to go to the synagogues even after the temple was rebuilt in the 1st century AD. Jews eventually found synagogues in major cities of the Roman Empire, and often it was there in those local synagogues where we would find Jesus or one of the apostles preaching the Christian message. Another major part of the Jewish religious life is the Sanhedrin. The Roman conquerors permitted the Jews to handle many of their own legal matters. Towns throughout Palestine had numerous local courts, but Jerusalem had the great Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, which met daily in the temple area, except for Sabbath days and other holy days. The high priest presided over the 70 other members of the court, who consisted of both Pharisees and Sadducees. In the New Testament, the Sanhedrin had the name of the council, and members of the Sanhedrin were called rulers or elders or scribes. However, in the 1st century, the Sanhedrin lacked the power of capital punishment, which is why they had to appeal to the Romans to execute Jesus after they found him worthy of death. The Jewish calendar and its holy days were also a significant part of the Jewish religion. The Jewish religious year had 7 festivals or feasts prescribed for annual worship. The first 5 were commissioned by God through Moses. They include the Passover, which celebrates the Exodus or the slaves being rescued from Egypt. And this was also the same feast that Jesus and the disciples were observing during what is called the Last Supper. We also have Pentecost, which is why the Jews from other nations were in Jerusalem during the time when the Holy Spirit miraculously came upon the disciples, as we see in Acts chapter 2. Rosh Hashanah is another major day, and that's basically the Jewish New Year. Then we have Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, and then also the Feast of Tabernacles. The last 2 Jewish holidays were originated after they came back from exile. One is called Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights, which celebrates the Maccabean Revolution and the defeat of the Seleucid Empire. And then the last one is the Feast of Purim, which celebrates the salvation of the Jewish people as told in the Old Testament book of Esther. As we talk about the geography of the New Testament world, it's important to know that Jesus spent most of his life in Palestine, a territory of no more than 10,000 square miles, about the size of the state of Vermont. The land of Palestine is located on the western border of the Arabian Desert. The western edge of Palestine, from Caesarea to Gaza, had a shoreline along the Mediterranean Sea of over 80 miles. From Mount Lebanon on the north to the southern end of the Dead Sea is a distance of about 175 miles. In the north, the distance from the Mediterranean to the Sea of Galilee is only 28 miles. And in the south, the distance from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea was only about 54 miles. The Jordan River divides the land as it flows from north to south, arising near the foot of Mount Hermon and flowing into the Dead Sea. To the east of the Jordan River are the areas of Perea and the Decapolis. The terrain of the land of Palestine changes very quickly and provides a variety of climates and resources. The coastal plain in the western part of Israel starts in the desert of the south and ends at Mount Carmel in the north. The climate of the coastal plain was mild, and because of that, the soil was also fertile, and so agriculture really flourished in this area. The hill country in the middle of Israel was rocky and barren. Its high elevation gave it a moderate climate. Most of the people raised grain and grapes and produced cattle. Jerusalem was located in the hill country, and most of Palestine's population lived in this section. Towns such as Nazareth, Cana, and Samaria were also in the hill country. Lakes and valleys and plains provided opportunities for fishing and farming. Trade routes also crisscrossed through this area. The Jordan Valley on the eastern side of Israel is a part of the gigantic rift in the earth which begins in the Taurus Mountains and continues through Palestine and Arabia and passes into the Red Sea and eventually ends in Africa. The Jordan River flows directly from the Sea of Galilee and ends at the Dead Sea, which has no outlet. It flows through a riverbed from 1 to 200 feet wide. In the northern part of Israel is the Sea of Galilee, a body of water that's about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide at its widest part, and at 682 feet below sea level. Sudden rushes of wind would come through and produce violent storms on this sea. And just to the west of it, in Jesus' day, were numerous towns and cities such as Capernaum and Cana and Nazareth. And on the eastern shore were very steep banks and some wild country. The area of the Dead Sea functions as an evaporating basin in which minerals and salts had collected over the centuries. The water is bitter to the taste, and nothing can grow in the Dead Sea itself. But in the New Testament times, the tropical climate of the area allowed the raising of fruits and crops, which could not grow in higher elevations. The eastern plateau across the Jordan stretches into the Arabian desert. In the New Testament times, the area east of the Jordan, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, was known as Decapolis. This was originally a federation of 10 cities settled by Greek-speaking people. Now, they were not a single political unit, for in the New Testament times, several rulers controlled that area. And although some Hebrew people lived in the area, the majority of the population there was Gentile or non-Jews. The Bible teaches that Jesus spent some time in that area and was familiar with the language and the customs and the beliefs of the people who lived there. In the New Testament times, the area of Palestine included 3 major provinces. In the north was Galilee, where a sizable Gentile population lived among the Jews. In the center was Samaria, containing a mixed race population, which had a mutual hatred for the Jews. And in the south was Judea, a heavily Jewish majority and with rigid Jewish customs and practices. Most of Jesus' ministry was spent in rugged Galilee. He visited such cities as Nazareth, Cana, and Capernaum. In Judea, Jesus confined his ministry basically to Jerusalem and such outlying villages such as Bethany and Emmaus. As you can see, there is a whole lot to learn about the world in which Jesus and his first followers lived. But each of these aspects of the New Testament world, its turbulent history, its difficult economy, its diverse cultures, and its rugged terrain, all play a significant role in the story of the gospel and of the rise of Christianity. With that said, let me encourage you to review the various parts of this lesson often, especially when you come upon the stories recorded in the New Testament scriptures. Knowing the background of these stories is really key in grasping the meaning of the message conveyed through them. Hey, thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.